The gravy was still steaming when I stood up and walked out. No one looked up. Not my mother, not my brother, and definitely not Claire. She was too busy snorting at something Julian had just whispered, holding his wrist like he might float away if she didn't anchor him. I wasn't angry in the traditional sense. Angry would have been easy. I was hollow. Hollow in a way that made each step toward the front door feel like I was moving underwater. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't take my phone. I just slipped out into the November air and let the cold bite at me, because at least that was something I could feel. From the sidewalk, I could still hear her laugh through the open dining room window. That laugh used to be mine, used to curl itself around my worst days like a blanket. Now it was spilling out of her and landing in someone else's lap. I needed, to see how long it would take. How many jokes, how many bites of roast, how many clinks of wine glasses before she realized her husband had vanished into the dark. So I stood there in the shadows, counting. 1, 2, 3. By the time I reached 30, my fingers were numb from the cold, but I stayed rooted in place like some pathetic garden statue. The front window framed the whole scene. My mother pouring wine, my aunt cutting into the roast, my brother nodding along to whatever pointless story Julian was telling. And Claire, she wasn't just laughing anymore. She was leaning so close their shoulders touched, her hand resting on the table in that half-open way she used to do with me, like a silent invitation to take it. I told myself I was only watching so I'd know exactly how long it took for her to notice I'd gone. But the truth is I couldn't tear my eyes away. Every time she tilted her head toward him, every time her lips curved in that slow smile, it was like watching someone pick through my memories and hand them to a stranger. I wasn't even jealous in the traditional sense. It felt stolen. At 60, my cousin accidentally knocked over a wine glass. It was the kind of loud, sharp sound that makes everyone flinch and glance around. Everyone but Claire. She just brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and said something that made Julian's shoulders shake with laughter. I could read her lips. You still remember that? And my stomach twisted because I knew she wasn't talking about me. At 90, I realized she might never notice. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not until I said something. And that's when a completely different idea hit me. I could go somewhere, anywhere, and just not come back for a while. Let her explain to everyone why her husband disappeared in the middle of dinner. Let her wonder if I was petty enough to do it on purpose. Spoiler, I was. So I stepped off the curb and started walking toward the corner, the sound of her laughter fading with each step. What I didn't expect was the figure leaning against the lamppost ahead, someone I knew, but shouldn't have. Someone who would make that night spiral into something far messier than I'd planned. I knew that silhouette before my brain even caught up. Lean frame, hunched shoulders, that nervous habit of rubbing his hands together. It was Mason, my old roommate from years ago. The guy had vanished from my life after a messy falling out involving an unpaid loan and a very suspicious dent in my car that he swore wasn't his fault. Seeing him now, standing under the yellow halo of the lamppost like some noir film cliché, didn't make sense. Mason was the kind of guy you ran into at gas stations or dollar stores at 2 in the morning, not outside your aunt's family dinner. I approached cautiously, half expecting him to either bolt or try to sell me something out of the trunk of his car. Didn't think you'd still be in town, I muttered, my breath clouding in the cold. He gave me this sly smile, like he'd been waiting for me. I knew you'd walk out, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You always do when you think no one's watching. His words hit me like ice water. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement, almost rehearsed. And that's when my stomach sank. How did he know? How could he possibly predict that I'd slip away from my own wife's side without a word? He glanced past me toward the glowing dining room window. She's with him tonight, isn't she? I didn't answer, but my silence was enough. Mason stepped closer, lowering his voice. You want to know how I knew? Because it's not the first time. My pulse spiked, and for a second I thought he meant Claire and Julian. But the look in his eyes told me this wasn't just about tonight. There was history here, and Mason knew more than he should. Part of me wanted to tell him to get lost, to stop playing whatever cryptic game he'd been rehearsing under that streetlight. But another part of me, the smaller, weaker part, the one that hated being in the dark, couldn't walk away. If he knew something about her, I needed to hear it. Even if it made me wish I'd just kept counting outside the window. When Mason finally started talking, I realized the dinner I'd left was nothing compared to the mess I was about to step into. Mason didn't ease into it. He never had the patience for that. Claire's been meeting him for months, he said, and my first stupid reaction was to assume he meant Julian. But Mason shook his head before I could even form the question. Not him. Someone else. And before you start thinking I'm here to stir the pot, I've seen them. Twice. Same cafe, same time of day, like clockwork. The words felt unreal, like they were bouncing off the inside of my skull without sinking in. How would you even know that? I asked, trying to keep my voice level, but it came out thinner than I wanted. Mason smirked like he'd been waiting for that. Because I work across the street now, I don't even have to try. Every Thursday at 11, she's there, ordering the same drink. And then he walks in, tall, dark hair, probably 10 years older than her. They sit in the corner booth and talk like they've got all the time in the world. No phones, no rush. I wanted to believe this was just Mason being his usual scheming self, but he described her little habits too perfectly. The way she tucks her sleeve into her palm when she's holding a cup, the way she tilts her head when she's listening like she's collecting every word. I thought it was harmless, Mason continued, until last week when I saw him reach across the table and take her hand. She didn't pull away. The street felt colder suddenly, like the wind had sharpened its teeth. I could still hear faint laughter from the dining room, and for a second I wondered if Julian and this mystery man were connected somehow, part of some sick puzzle I hadn't noticed until tonight. My brain was sprinting ahead, trying to piece together every time she'd been running errands or meeting a friend from yoga. Mason stepped back into the lamplight, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. You think walking out tonight will get her attention? You've already lost it. Question is, how much more do you want to find out? I stared at him, torn between going back inside and pretending nothing had happened or following this thread into whatever dark place it was going to lead. And deep down, I already knew which choice I was going to make. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there listening to Claire's even breathing beside me, every inhale and exhale sounding like a lie I couldn't unhear. Mason's words kept looping in my head, every Thursday at 11, until it stopped feeling like gossip and started feeling like an invitation. By morning, I decided exactly what I was going to do. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. I told Claire I had a meeting out of town, made a whole show of packing my laptop bag, even kissed her goodbye like I actually meant it. Then I parked my car 2 blocks from the cafe Mason had described, the one with the pale blue awning and mismatched chairs outside. I sat there in the driver's seat, watching the door through my windshield, feeling both ridiculous and sick. Part of me prayed Mason had been lying just to get under my skin, that I'd spend the day in my car for nothing. At 10:57, she appeared, scarf tucked neatly under her coat, hair falling just so, the exact level of effort she used for casual days that weren't casual at all. She stepped inside, and seconds later, the man Mason had mentioned followed, tall, dark hair streaked with silver, wearing the kind of expensive coat you don't buy unless you're trying to make a statement. He didn't just sit across from her. He sat next to her, sliding into the booth like they were picking up a conversation from 5 minutes ago instead of a week. I told myself I'd just watch, nothing more. But then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small envelope, and slid it toward her under the table. She didn't even hesitate. She tucked it into her bag without opening it. My pulse was pounding so hard I barely noticed when she leaned in and said something that made him smile in this slow, knowing way. It wasn't just friendly. It was deliberate. That's when I realized I wasn't just watching for proof anymore. I was waiting for a reason. A reason to either confront her right here in public or to follow this man when he left. And when he finally stood up and walked out, glancing over his shoulder once like he knew I'd be there, I didn't even think. I just started the engine. I had no idea that following him would take me somewhere I wasn't prepared to see. The moment his taillights flared, I knew I was committed. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than I'd like to admit, the old engine rumbling just enough to mask the pounding in my ears. He drove with this calculated ease, not in any rush, but not meandering either, like he had a destination in mind and had already factored in every stoplight on the way. I stayed 3 cars behind, close enough to keep him in sight, far enough that I wouldn't be obvious. The city blurred by, rows of brick buildings giving way to the quiet streets on the edge of town. We passed diners with neon signs buzzing in the window, shuttered shops, a gas station where the attendant leaned on the counter like he hadn't moved in an hour. And then, Without warning, the man flicked on his blinker and turned down a narrow side street I didn't recognize. No houses, no storefronts, just a long stretch of cracked asphalt lined with old warehouses. He pulled into a fenced lot behind one of the buildings, the kind of place you'd expect to see forklifts and pallets, not sleek, expensive sedans. I eased my car to a stop half a block away, killing the headlights. Through the chain-link fence, I watched him step out and greet another man who emerged from the shadows. There was a handshake. No, more than that. It was an exchange. Something small and metallic passed between them, catching the faint glow of the street lamp. My breath fogged up the windshield as I strained to see. They spoke for a few minutes, both of them glancing around in that quick, twitchy way that makes your stomach knot. Then the silver-haired man, the one from the cafe, pulled out his phone, glanced at the screen, and smirked. It wasn't until he turned toward the light that I saw what was on his display. Claire's contact photo. My Claire. I didn't hear the rest of their conversation. My pulse was in my ears, drowning everything out. He pocketed the phone, shook hands again, and disappeared inside the warehouse without looking back. And there I sat, in the cold, in the dark, trying to decide whether to follow him in, or turn the key and pretend I'd never seen any of this. What I didn't know was that whichever choice I made next, I wasn't leaving that street without something changing forever. I told myself I'd just take a quick look, maybe snap a picture of the license plate and drive off. But when I saw the warehouse doors swing shut behind him, something in me pushed harder than my sense of self-preservation. I slipped out of the car, the cold air biting into my skin, and crept along the side of the fence until I found a section where the chain link sagged just enough to duck under. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes far louder than I wanted, but the street was dead silent. No cars, no dogs barking, just that distant hum of city life fading away. The warehouse smelled like machine oil and dust, a stale air that made me feel like I'd stepped decades back in time. I could hear muffled voices somewhere deeper inside. Following the sound, I edged past stacks of wooden pallets and rows of covered machinery until I found a narrow opening in the tarp wall. Through it, I saw the silver-haired man seated at a metal table, his coat draped neatly over the chair beside him. Across from him sat a man I didn't recognize, heavy-set, wearing a leather jacket, flipping open a black case filled with what looked like documents. No, not just documents. There were photographs, too. I leaned closer, trying to catch the details, when I heard it, my wife's name. Spoken so casually, like she was a mutual acquaintance in some club I'd never been invited to. She's reliable, the heavy-set man said, sliding one of the photos across the table. The silver-haired man glanced at it and smiled faintly before tucking it away in a folder. My pulse was hammering now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about romance at all. It was business. And whatever business it was, Claire was in the middle of it. I backed away slowly, my breath shaking in the cold air that leaked through the warehouse walls. Part of me wanted to burst in, demand answers, rip that folder open and see exactly what they had on her. But another part, the part still clinging to the last shreds of control, knew I needed to get out before they realized I was there. As I turned to leave, my foot caught the edge of a loose board, sending it clattering against the floor. The voices stopped. Chairs scraped. And then came the sound I'd been dreading, footsteps. Getting closer. The footsteps closed in, quick and deliberate, echoing off the bare concrete walls. I darted behind a stack of crates, my heart thudding like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. One shadow stretched long across the floor, then another. I held my breath, waiting for a hand to yank me out or for someone to shout. But instead, I heard the warehouse door creak open, followed by the rush of cold night air. The footsteps moved away. I took my chance. Slipping out the same way I'd come in, I kept low until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, but I didn't drive off. Not yet. Across the lot, the silver-haired man was talking on his phone, his breath visible in the cold. Then I heard it, her name again, but this time followed by a laugh and, yeah, it's done. Tell her she's free. Free. The word hit differently. I didn't follow him this time. I drove straight home, my head spinning, Mason's voice battling with what I'd just heard. Claire was in the kitchen when I walked in, startled to see me hours early. She put down her mug slowly, her eyes scanning my face. "You know, don't you?" she said. I just nodded. Turns out, the man from the cafe wasn't a lover, He was a lawyer. She'd been quietly untangling herself from an old, binding contract tied to her family's failing business, one that could have bankrupted us both if it went public. She hadn't told me because she didn't want me dragged into the stress and legal mess. Julian at the dinner? Pure coincidence. Mason? Well, Mason never knew the full story. We stayed up the whole night, her explaining every detail, me realizing just how much of my own insecurity had built this entire storm in my head. By morning, it felt lighter, not fixed, not perfect, but real again. And the funny thing? At the next family dinner, I didn't leave early. I didn't count. I just stayed. And for the first time in a long time, she laughed in a way that felt like it was only for me.